Hello learners, I'm Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, IGNOU. In the previous session, I had discussed with you about some of the problems that are faced by NGOs in terms of various practical issues like finances, like leadership, and so on. Today we are going to discuss an extremely important issue, namely the ethical challenges of NGOs. While the practical challenges deal with the bread and butter issues, ethical challenges are a little more complex because they deal with the complex domains of values. What is right, what is wrong, what is morally good, what is morally inappropriate, and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about this very, very important issues, ethical challenges of NGOs. Let's begin by talking a little bit about what we mean by the term ethics. So the term ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, which means custom, habit, character, or disposition. The term means a system of moral principles which affect how people make decisions and lead their lives. Ethics are concerned with what is good and what is bad for both individuals and society. So one of the important questions here is, how does one lead a good life? What are the values? What are the ideals? What are the principles that will enable one to lead a good life? This comes within the domain of ethics. Another important area that ethics addresses is that of rights and responsibilities. So all of us have rights, but we also have responsibilities towards others. Ethics also addresses the language of what is right and what is wrong. And this is really at the core of what we mean by ethics. So why are ethics useful? Why are we talking about ethics at all? In the first place, ethics provide us a moral map. In other words, a kind of a framework with which we deal with emotive or challenging issues. There are many issues that we deal with, and particularly when NGOs deal with certain issues pertaining to poverty, pertaining to gender inequality and gender justice, pertaining to violence, so many extremely troubling issues that have emotive and challenging dimensions to them. In this context, if we react purely instinctively or emotionally to these challenges, it may not be a very appropriate way to deal with them. And that is why an ethical framework provides us with a kind of a moral compass, a kind of a set of guiding principles with which we can address or with which we can approach challenging or difficult issues. Ethics also helps us to think about the other. It is very, very natural to think about our own self-interest, what works for us, our own needs, our own wants, our own desires. But thinking about others is really what distinguishes human beings from all other species. We have the capacity to be compassionate, to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who may not be as lucky or as fortunate as us. And therefore, ethics enable us to think about the perspective of people other than ourselves. Ethics are also a source of group strength. They inspire groups with certain value systems, with certain common ideals that help the group to become strong and work together cooperatively. And ethics pertains to making people good. So it's not just about good actions, but it is also how people themselves can behave in a manner or behave like good people. So ethics are a very, very important aspect of our day-to-day life, and more so when we are working in organizations, when we are working in NGOs, ethics become a very, very important principle or become a very, very important resource that we have to make use of, that we have to abide by. So what role do ethics play in organizations? Now here I'm not just talking about NGOs, I'm talking about all kinds of organizations, whether it is a corporate house, whether it is a small business, and so on and so forth. We find that ethical philosophy of an organization affects its productivity, its reputation, and its corporate culture. So if an organization is known to have a very, very solid system of ethics, is very mindful of its ethical behavior, we find that this kind of an organization enjoys high repute and becomes a place where people would like to work in. It is also important for a positive, people-friendly organizational culture, and this leads to very good employee retention and the morale of workers. So an organization which has got a good work ethic, which has got a good ethic of being people-friendly, such an organization is more likely to be respected in the community, to be an organization that people want to work for. The term corporate social responsibility also is something that is being widely used these days. And an organization which has a strong sense of corporate social responsibility demonstrates how it is concerned not just about the bottom line, not just about profits, but also about social concerns and its commitment to community development and to the weaker sections of society. So more and more we find that CSR, or corporate social responsibility, has become a very, very important indicator which is used to really assess or measure the ethical framework or the ethical philosophy that underpins any organization. So let's talk now about the subject at hand, which is ethical issues and NGOs. Now, as you all know, NGOs have emerged as key players both nationally and internationally. They have a major role to play in developmental activities, in empowerment of weaker sections of society, providing assistance and aid to those who are in distress, and in operating as independent and service-driven entities. Naturally, this is bound to present a host of practical as well as ethical challenges. Remember, the non-governmental aspect of NGOs means that these are independent organizations which have to have a philosophy or have to have a way of working which is independent of government controls or government patronage. And this, in a sense, makes their journey quite a difficult one or quite a challenging one. So let's take a look at some of the important guiding principles for ethical functioning of NGOs. This particular part or these ethical principles I draw from the Code of Ethics and Conduct for NGOs, the compliance manual which was compiled by the World Association of NGOs. So let's go back to the first important guiding principles: responsibility, service, and public-mindedness. Now this is really crucial because the work of NGOs or the responsibility that NGOs have is providing much needed services to the general public, which implies that they are not there to work for themselves. They are not there to just work for their own interests, but their entire functioning is driven by providing service to the wider community or to that section of society that they have been designed to serve. And public-mindedness, what does this mean? This means that NGOs owe a very big responsibility to being very particular about the way in which they use public resources, the way in which they use funds, their responsibility towards society, their responsibility towards the environment, their responsibility towards the weaker sections, and so on. So this fundamental guiding principle really is at the heart of how NGOs can function ethically. The next important guiding principle is cooperation beyond boundaries. So what does this mean? This means that NGOs need to cooperate and collaborate beyond narrow boundaries of region, beyond narrow boundaries of religion, caste, race, and so on. So all NGOs that are working for the benefit of humankind, that are working for the benefit of marginalized sections of society, must render support and assistance to each other. There must be a common cause which goes beyond petty personal interests. So cooperation beyond boundaries really defines the way in which NGOs cooperate with each other and cooperate with all those sections of society that are there in order to promote human rights and the welfare of the underprivileged. Which brings us to a very, very important dimension of guiding principles for ethical functioning of NGOs. And this refers to human rights and dignity. Remember, human rights are at the very heart of the work that NGOs are supposed to do. NGOs have to place human rights front and center of all their activities and have to be extremely mindful of the dignity of all human beings to achieve their rights and to live as people, as complete persons, as persons with all the rights to develop, all the rights to grow, all the rights to lead a dignified and a happy life. So NGOs are duty-bound to place human rights of all their beneficiaries, of all the persons that they work with, right at the heart of their functioning. Another very important principle that has been identified by the World Association of NGOs is that of religious freedom. This is very, very important. Everybody has the right to profess their own faith. Everybody has the right to practice their own religion. And NGOs are not supposed to interfere with or try to put any limitations or any conditionalities on religious freedom. Transparency and accountability. This is also, like we have mentioned in the previous talk also, regarding the need for NGOs to be accountable to the public, accountable to society for the work that they do, for the way they utilize their money, for their funding sources. So they have to be accountable. Their work, the work that they do, the way in which they deploy funds, etc., their hiring policies, all should be very, very transparent and very, very open for public scrutiny. And the last guiding principle that has been identified is truthfulness and legality. We cannot stress this with any more emphasis. Truthfulness really is a fundamental value. NGOs are not supposed to lie, are not supposed to exaggerate, are not supposed to misrepresent the work that they do. Once again, this boils down to public scrutiny and, of course, legality. The work that they do has to be within the pale of legal frameworks. They cannot allow their humanitarian functioning to be used or misused to flout the law or to engage in illegal activities in the name of humanitarian work. So all these guiding principles that we have gone over, they all interact with each other. They are all part and parcel of each other. So even though we have made a kind of an analytical difference between all these principles, they in fact all are interdependent upon and intertwined with each other. Let's talk about some other special issues and concerns which really raise many ethical challenges and concerns for NGOs. To begin with, working with marginalized or vulnerable communities, as we know, is an extremely responsible work, is a work that comes with its own set of ethical challenges. Whenever we work with people who are weaker than us in terms of their socio-economic position, there is always the danger of a power differential coming into play and the more powerful making use of or exploiting the less powerful. Another issue about which a lot has been discussed is the issue of the way in which other people's vulnerability or misery is marketed or in a sense exploited, it is sold, it is displayed so that NGOs can mobilize funds. So I've used the term marketing poverty. Is it right, is it ethically appropriate to show people's misery in such a way that other people would be forced to take pity and then lend money or give donations? There are two issues involved here. We all know that NGOs need to mobilize funds. But at the same time, to show the misery of people as a marketing device is an ethically very, very difficult kind of a decision to make. And a lot of criticism has been leveled against those NGOs who use the photographs, who use the details, who use the personal details of people from vulnerable communities, people who have been victims of violence, people who have been victims of war, and so on and so forth, and who display their images without really giving any thought to how these people would feel about their images being so displayed in order to raise funds. So this is something that NGOs really need to think about. This basically implies disregarding the will or the agency of the recipients or the beneficiaries of NGO assistance. We've very often seen that, for example, certain NGOs who are dealing with persons with disabilities will show the faces, who will very freely display the identities of the people who they are working with, without really taking consent of the person involved, or maybe taking consent of the guardian. So, in a way, showing people as objects of pity, showing people as objects of charity, this is something that is really not respectful of the recipients or the beneficiaries of the work that NGOs do. And, like I've mentioned while talking about the first point itself, power dynamics, a top-down approach to dealing with persons who need assistance or persons who are being served by that NGO. The role of participation, or really taking on the needs, taking on the views, taking on the voices of those who are being served on board, is also very, very important in order to prevent, or in order to deal with the very, very difficult power dynamic of people who are, in a sense, beneficiaries of socio-economic well-being, and those who are poor, those who are marginalized, those who are helpless and in need of assistance. So, like we mentioned, are we giving voice, or are NGOs giving the opportunity for disadvantaged sections to voice their concerns? Or are they voicing those concerns on their behalf? Are they appropriating or taking over the voice of others? This is also a very, very important issue that needs reflection and self-reflection by NGO functionaries. Is the work of NGOs to empower people or to make them more dependent? This is also a very, very tricky ethical dilemma, or an ethical question that NGOs need to deal with and need to actually understand very, very carefully. And maintaining autonomy, maintaining integrity, resisting interference and manipulation of vested interests. This is in fact one of the very, very important challenges that many NGOs face, wherein, like I've mentioned, they may actually be taken over as some kind of a front for various illegal activities in the guise of a humanitarian organization. So it's very, very important for NGOs to be mindful of the fact that their good work may actually be used or may actually be misrepresented for vested interests. So what are some of the important takeaways that this particular lecture is supposed to give you, or that you are really supposed to, act upon? The first and the most important is that ethics and ethical conduct lies at the heart of credible and reputable organizations. And really, I cannot emphasize this point more, because good NGOs, reputable NGOs, world-famous NGOs are those which have clean and untainted records. These are organizations that people really are very, very confident associating with, very confident funding, very confident donating to. And that is because of their ethics and their ethical conduct demonstrated over many, many years. The second important point to bear in mind is that NGOs deal with vulnerable and marginalized communities, and hence they face immense practical and ethical challenges. What could be some of these vulnerable communities? Women, for instance. We find that all over the world, women tend to be the community, or tend to be the group of people that is at the receiving end of patriarchal norms, patriarchal violence. Persons with disability, for instance, very often we find that it is only NGOs who really are concerned with this extremely vulnerable and marginalized section of the community. We find that the existence of policies and programs for persons with disabilities at the governmental level or at the state level are probably not as effective as those which are dealt with by grassroots organizations who actually work with these individuals. NGOs also deal with communities like tribal communities, ethnic minorities, communities that are vulnerable, which have been displaced, which are victims of large developmental projects, which have been rendered homeless, or communities which have suffered acute distress due to natural calamities. So these are all communities, these are all people who display extreme vulnerability. These are people in need of assistance. But because they are vulnerable and because they are in need of assistance does not mean that their dignity, their worth as human beings can be compromised. So, while rendering assistance to these communities, their dignity, their human rights have to be kept right at the very heart of the work that NGOs do. And this can actually be immensely challenging, both in terms of practical activities as well as ethical values. As NGOs are non-governmental organizations, like we have mentioned, they have to rely upon the general public for their funding. Uncertainty of funding can expose them to the risk of exploitation and manipulation. NGOs, like we've mentioned, work with people who experience poverty and multiple levels of marginality. And so, they must be sensitive and mindful to treat them with respect. Marketing the misery of people for garnering funds and support is ethically a very uncomfortable choice and something that NGOs need to reflect upon very, very carefully. Being mindful about ethical issues and challenges is crucial while we are dealing with other human beings. And the work of NGOs is primarily to deal with other human beings. What are some of the ways that NGOs can actually bring a solid frame of ethics onto the table? Training to NGO functionaries in human rights and ethics can help to sensitize them and help them to cope better. I hope that this session has enabled you to think through some of the very ticklish and difficult issues of NGO work, which has important ethical dimensions, which deals with a lot of important moral questions because we are dealing with people and people who are vulnerable. And bringing these ethical and moral issues on the table, discussing them, talking about them, learning about them, training ourselves about them, reading important legal documents, reading important documents on codes of ethics that have been generated, that have been developed by international organizations, can certainly help us to gain a perspective on these matters, which may really have escaped us earlier, or which we may not have given very much thought to earlier. So, do consider, do think about the ethical dimensions of the work that NGOs do, because ethical organizations are organizations which in the long run are successful organizations, an organization which enjoy the support of society, which enjoy the support of all the stakeholders who are associated with them. Thank you.